He froze at the edge of the runway, refusing to move even an inch. No one understood why, until a hidden danger beneath the tarmac changed everything. What they uncovered next made the entire base go silent. Here's the full story. But before we get into it, drop your favorite dog's breed in the comments below and make sure you've subscribed, because what's coming next, trust me, you won't want to miss it. The morning began like any other at the Denver Air Logistics Hub, a sprawling joint-use facility tucked at the edge of a military base and civilian airstrip. Haze lingered low over the Colorado foothills, softening the rugged outline of hangars, radar towers, and idle cargo planes. It was 5:18 a.m., and most of the base was already humming with preparations for a high-profile transport flight scheduled for takeoff in just under 2 hours. A military-chartered C-130 Hercules sat at the end of the runway apron, its massive propellers still as ground crews finalized safety checks and loaded specialized cargo. Among the day's personnel was a K-9 handler, Sergeant Maria Alvarez, who had arrived with her trusted German Shepherd, Rocco. The dog had been with her for nearly 5 years, serving on bomb detection and hazardous materials sweeps. He wasn't just her partner, he was the reason she'd survived more than one deployment where instincts had outpaced equipment. Today, Rocco's assignment was standard: conduct a final sweep of the aircraft and surrounding tarmac before the VIP cargo was loaded. Sensitive equipment headed for a high-security satellite installation in Nevada. Nothing unusual, nothing flagged. At least that's what every human report had said. Rocco, however, had other plans. As Maria parked near the service lane and unlatched Rocco's gate in the rear of the armored van, he bolted out and scanned the environment like a coiled spring released. His black and tan coat glistened in the rising sun, breath-forming puffs in the frigid air. Normally, he would jog beside her on the leash, tail low, ears tuned, moving with methodical confidence. But today, the second he caught sight of the aircraft ahead, he stopped cold. Not slowed, stopped. Maria gave the leash a light tug. "Come on, boy." He didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his body, head tilted slightly, and planted his paws. His eyes locked not on the aircraft, but the expanse of tarmac directly ahead of it, the narrow corridor that formed the loading approach between Hangar 4 and the refueling station. His breathing shifted. Shallow, controlled, focused. Maria froze too. She'd seen this stance before. Rocco wasn't refusing out of confusion or stubbornness. He was alerting. At the same time, a forklift driver shuttled a large crate across the far side of the runway. 2 ground crewmen chuckled nearby as they wrapped up their rigging task. A fuel truck idled 20 feet from the loading zone, waiting for the go-ahead. Nothing seemed out of place, at least to everyone else. But Maria had learned the hard way never to second-guess Rocco's instincts. She crouched beside him, brushing a hand over his shoulder. His muscles were taut beneath her palm, his eyes locked on a fixed point across the concrete. She followed his gaze. It looked like nothing, just tarmac, a maintenance grate, a series of standard landing lights embedded in the surface. Still, he wouldn't budge. Somewhere behind them, a voice crackled on a nearby walkie-talkie, relaying final clearance codes for takeoff. The tension around them continued rising like steam under a sealed pot, but Rocco didn't react. He was in detection mode now, and Maria knew better than to rush it. She gave him space, unclipped his lead. "Show me," she whispered. Rocco sprang forward, not toward the aircraft, but backward in a wide arc, circling along the far edge of the service route and skirting the hangar perimeter. He was tracing something, not a smell per se, but a pattern, an anomaly in his mental blueprint of how things were supposed to be. As Maria followed, she couldn't help but feel the creeping unease building in her chest. This was supposed to be routine. Why now? Why here? By the time Rocco slowed again, he had led her to the far corner of the tarmac, near the rear fence. just beside the primary electrical relay box that powered a portion of the runway lights. A thin sheet of frost coated the unit's exterior. Nothing looked tampered with, but Rocco's nose was pressed to the ground now, moving inch by inch. His tail stiffened. A low growl rumbled in his throat. The growl wasn't aggression, it was communication. He was warning her. Maria stepped back and hit the emergency frequency on her comm unit. Within 90 seconds, base security had locked down the south end of the runway and dispatched an ordnance disposal technician. Still, to the untrained eye, there was nothing there. And yet, while the specialist prepared his gear, Maria crouched again beside Rocco, who had now laid down beside the relay box, front paws extended, nose nearly touching a barely visible seam in the concrete. She saw it then, what he'd likely picked up long before she noticed, a tiny irregularity in the expansion joint seal. Someone had opened this area before. Recently, the EOD tech finally arrived and conducted a preliminary radiation and chemical sweep. At first, he got nothing. He nearly dismissed it until he extended the scan 3 feet further than the usual radius. Then something pinged, faint but real. Metallic residue where no recent construction had been logged. A heat signature inconsistent with the ambient temperature. A secondary sweep confirmed it, an unauthorized buried device. Size unknown. Origin unknown. Purpose still unclear. By now, Maria's heart was pounding. The flight was scheduled to depart in 40 minutes. The aircraft sat fueled and ready, and this device sitting undetected beneath the approach path was positioned just close enough to suggest intentional placement, timed proximity, not a random drop, not leftover infrastructure. Whoever placed it knew the schedule, knew the loading path, knew that few, if anyone, would check beneath a seemingly mundane relay box. Except Rocco did. Within the hour, the tarmac had transformed into a crime scene. Explosive experts were rerouted from nearby Fort Carson. The aircraft's departure was delayed indefinitely. Cargo was evacuated. Personnel reassigned, and Rocco, he sat quietly beside Maria, tail still, eyes following every movement of the unfolding chaos, not anxious, not excited, just aware, as though he'd always known this day would test him in a way that drills and certifications never could. As forensic teams moved in with ground-penetrating radar and micro cameras, more details emerged. The device was encased in a specialized polymer difficult to detect through traditional scans and wired in a way that didn't immediately register as explosive but wasn't benign either. Perhaps it was a disruptor, perhaps an electronic pulse emitter, or worse, an experimental sabotage tool not yet cataloged in defense systems. What struck the investigative team most was how precisely it was placed, not beneath the aircraft, not close enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but within proximity to exploit either blast radius or signal interference, depending on the device's nature. Every detail suggested insider knowledge, and someone had banked on a standard protocol sweep that would rely on human procedures and mechanical sensors, but not canine instinct. As dusk fell that day and the investigation expanded, officials began reviewing security logs and footage from the past 72 hours. That's when the first thread of a broader story began to unravel. A contractor's ID used after hours. A van not logged on the base's official entrance sheet. A shadowy figure moving near Hangar 4, visible only for seconds before disappearing behind the fuel depot. Meanwhile, Maria sat in a quiet room near the base's veterinary unit, watching Rocco as he slept in a curled shape against the padded floor. Even at rest, his ears flicked with every hallway echo, attuned to the world even in his downtime. Her thoughts drifted to their last mission overseas, where he had spotted a tripwire the entire unit had missed, or the time he refused to cross a pedestrian bridge during a city patrol, moments before its lower beam collapsed from structural fatigue. Every time she'd trusted him, she'd survived. Every time she'd tried to override him, she still regretted it. And now this, not just a prevented explosion, but a larger implication of vulnerability at a high-security installation. All because a four-legged officer sensed that something, however subtle, was wrong, and he refused to step forward. Not out of fear, but out of knowing, out of instinct, out of trust. The tarmac remained cordoned off through the night. Bright arc lights bathed the scene in artificial daylight as forensic teams worked into the early hours, documenting, extracting, and analyzing the device unearthed from beneath the relay box. Maria stayed on base, though she wasn't technically required to. She couldn't bring herself to leave. Neither could Rocco, who lay watchfully in the corner of the command tent, his ears flicking at every footstep and zippered entry flap. The discovery, while alarming, was only the beginning. By dawn, analysts had determined that the device wasn't explosive, at least not in the traditional sense. It was a compact signal interceptor and disruptor, fitted with components designed to interfere with airborne navigation and communications. Its placement near the power hub for the runway lights had been deliberate, aimed at masking its emissions beneath the station's existing electrical field. Had it activated during takeoff, the C-130's onboard systems might have begun misreading navigation data or experiencing low-level signal warping, not enough to alert pilots immediately, but enough to guide them into the wrong altitude, the wrong heading, the wrong decisions during a critical climb-out phase. In a scenario involving dense cargo, complex airspace, and a tight fuel margin, that sort of interference could have ended catastrophically, and no one would have suspected anything other than pilot error or instrumentation malfunction. The enemy wasn't fire or shrapnel this time, it was confusion by design. Rocco had sensed it. Not the device itself, perhaps, but the subtle taint it left in the chemical atmosphere, residual human scent where it shouldn't have been. Polymer casing leaching trace compounds into the soil, something just barely out of place, something the others would have never known to question. Meanwhile, Command had launched a full security breach investigation. The footage pulled from the hangar's outer perimeter had already begun pointing fingers. The man seen ducking behind the fuel station bore the posture and uniform of a civilian contractor, specifically one from the radar calibration team subcontracted for routine maintenance on the secondary tower. At first glance, he'd used legitimate credentials, a vehicle with matching clearance decals, and access times logged into the base's database. But deeper scrutiny revealed the visit wasn't officially scheduled for that day. No technician had reported issues that required off-hour repairs, and no supervisor had requested supplemental checks. His badge ID? Real but expired. His name? Cross-reference to a former subcontractor discharged 2 years prior for bypassing safety procedures during an overseas installation. By noon, the man had a name, Lucas Hanley, age 38. No prior arrests, no formal ties to foreign entities, but the patterns were forming. A network of corporate rivalries, lapses in contractor vetting, and potentially a deeper motive than money. Maria was called in for a debrief just as the FBI liaison arrived on base. She recounted Rocco's behavior in exacting detail, the pause, the alert stance, the redirection away from the aircraft. No embellishment, no theory, just the facts. The way her partner had drawn a line on the ground and refused to cross it. The FBI agent, a plain-spoken man in his 50s, listened carefully, then asked a quiet question. "Do you think your dog understood what he found?" Maria paused, glancing at Rocco, now sleeping beside her chair, the faint twitch of a dream passing through his paws. "No," she said. "I think he understood what shouldn't be there. That's enough." The story made its way up the chain fast. By that evening, the Secretary of Defense's office had been briefed, and high-level messages were relayed to local command regarding base-wide vulnerability assessments. It was no longer just a K-9 alert. It was a breach of national operational security, one that had nearly gone unnoticed. Back in the barracks, Maria showered, changed into civilian sweats, and took Rocco for a quiet walk around the secured perimeter road. The air smelled different after the storm that rolled in late afternoon, cleaner, sharper, and more alive. The tension had settled in the way fog lifts, not suddenly, but as a gradual release of pressure. She watched her dog trot alongside her, the rhythmic click of his paws on pavement like a metronome of certainty. He didn't know about the layers of politics, the breadth of what he'd prevented. He didn't need to. All he knew was that something felt wrong that morning, and he refused to let her ignore it. Meanwhile, another thread unraveled across the city. That same night, at a private airfield on the outskirts of Fort Collins, a mechanic noticed something strange while inspecting a turboprop scheduled for early departure. The cargo manifest for the aircraft included communications relay hardware for a legitimate telecom contract, but the pilot on the manifest didn't match any licensed operator in the state. A call to Homeland Security was made, and within 3 hours a sting operation commenced. No dramatic arrests, no high-speed chases, just quiet intervention, the kind the public never hears about. The aircraft, when searched, contained encrypted hard drives, foreign transmission devices, and a burned notebook that referenced multiple air bases, including Denver. Lucas Hanley was their link. He had been scheduled to rendezvous with that plane. He never made it, because of a dog who refused to take a step. As investigations converged, analysts noticed something disturbing. The sabotage wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a broader strategy involving minimal damage psychological disruptions at critical infrastructure points, airports, military hubs, energy corridors, just enough to destabilize, confuse, and create doubt in protocols. But none of the other attempts had been stopped. Only this one. And only because of a four-legged officer who was never trained to detect sabotage, only to trust his nose and alert when something violated the invisible rules he lived by. By the third day, the device had been neutralized and deconstructed. Engineers studied its architecture, discovering a system that could mimic friendly signals while transmitting subtle anomalies. The intelligence gained from its internals became invaluable. Yet none of that meant more to Maria than the moment she stood on the now silent tarmac and watched Rocco sniff the same route he had once refused. He walked it now, measured, calm, tail flicking once. This time he kept going. That was all the confirmation she needed. 3 weeks passed. Snow began to fall lightly over the Denver logistics hub, covering the runways in a thin white veil. Most personnel moved on from the incident, absorbed by new priorities. Flights resumed. Crews returned to routine. Reports were filed, protocols reviewed, commendations quietly circulated. The base machine hummed on, but beneath that normalcy something had changed. A subtle ripple, carried not in the tone of command meetings or the revisions to SOP manuals, but in glances between seasoned officers, those who'd seen enough to understand how easily disaster could wear a mask of normal. They didn't say it aloud, but everyone knew the truth. It hadn't been luck that stopped what nearly unfolded. It had been loyalty, instinct, an unspoken bond between a handler and her K9. Maria and Rocco were transferred temporarily to a newly formed joint task force, examining the role of animal units in predictive threat detection. The brass didn't call it that, of course. On paper, it was Multi-Sensory Field Deployment Evaluation Initiative, but in whispered halls it was simply referred to as the Rocco model. That didn't sit comfortably with Maria. Not because she didn't believe in what her dog had done, but because to elevate it as a model missed the quiet personal truth underneath. What had happened wasn't process or training, it was relationship. The kind that forms over years, in silence, through missions where no one else sees the moment when a human's life hangs on the nuance of a canine's breath. Rocco didn't alert because he was told to. He alerted because he knew her, and he knew something was about to hurt her. They were posted for 2 weeks at Nellis Air Force Base, reviewing K-9 surveillance patterns across multiple installations. During that time, Maria observed other teams, handlers proud of their dogs, but distracted by smartphones or checklists. She watched officers clip leashes like they were plugging in wires. Efficient, technical, but something was missing. These dogs were skilled, no doubt, but they weren't trusted. She knew what it cost to trust a dog's silent warning over the loud logic of a scheduled operation. It cost her tension, scrutiny, and nearly her reputation, but it also saved lives. And in those silent moments on the airstrip, when no one else saw what her partner did, that trust had been the only thing separating calm from chaos. One evening, while debriefing quietly with the logistics coordinator, she learned something that struck deeper than she expected. A memo had been circulated recommending non-human sensor integration as a supplement to electronic pre-flight inspections across select installations. It was technical, dry, but buried in the proposal was a name, Rocco. Initial case model. Maria folded the paper slowly and stared across the hangar, where Rocco lay curled by her travel duffel. His ears flicked once, picking up a faraway hum from a distant maintenance vehicle. He looked peaceful, ordinary. But Maria knew, inside that calm beat the most alert and protective presence she'd ever known. Her thoughts drifted to the day of the alert. What if she hadn't listened? What if she'd pulled the leash, nudged him forward, dismissed it as nerves or cold weather resistance? What if she'd chosen protocol over partnership? It would have been just one small step onto the tarmac, and it would have been the last step anyone made that day. Rocco had stepped in so she didn't have to, and now the ripple of that choice was changing policy, shaping training, influencing how future missions would view their canine partners, not as gear or backup, but as co-equal agents of perception. By the end of their assignment, they were summoned back to Denver, not for another mission, but for something quieter, more enduring. A small ceremony was held in Hangar 3. No cameras, no press, just base command, a few handlers, the investigators whose work had followed the trail Rocco began, and the crew that would have flown that day. One by one they came forward, offering quiet thanks. No speeches, no medals, just acknowledgement. The pilot from the grounded flight stepped up last. He stood before Maria, then crouched before Rocco. He extended a gloved hand, not to pet, but to let the dog choose. Rocco sniffed, paused, then pressed his head gently against the man's chest. That was enough. Later, back in her quarters, Maria found a small envelope tucked inside her gear. No sender name, no official markings. Inside was a folded card, plain white, unlined. It read, "Your dog didn't just save my life, he saved my children's father. Thank you for listening to him when no one else would." There were no signatures. There didn't need to be. Some gratitude is too big for names. That night, Maria lay beside Rocco on the floor, just like they'd done in the field, in tents, in barracks, in station houses. No barriers, no ranks, just partners. The dog exhaled deeply in his sleep. His tail gave a lazy thump. She thought about how many times she'd told herself that one day he would save her, that she'd know it when it came. And now that it had, she realized something deeper. He hadn't saved her once. He'd been saving her every day they'd worked together. Every breath, every alert, every moment of doubt, he replaced with quiet certainty. This wasn't about a single incident. It was about 5 years of being seen, not as superior or inferior, but as trusted, as someone worth protecting, as someone to follow, and someone to lead when it mattered most. Before lights out, she reached into her duffel and pulled out a single strip of beef jerky, her emergency stash. She broke it in half. He woke the instant the scent hit the air. She smiled and whispered, "Payment for services rendered." He took the treat gently, settling back into his curl. She leaned her forehead against his, and for a moment in that tiny barracks room filled with silence and loyalty and breath, the world made perfect sense. If this story gave you chills, wait till you see what's coming tomorrow. Hit that like button if you believe dogs deserve more recognition, and don't forget to subscribe because the next story might just leave you speechless.